Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's my weekly podcast where we discuss a book, interview the author, and then take a look at something that I've been watching in the past week. And this week, we're going to be discussing the book Come November. The author, Scott Lord. Before we get into that, I just want to say thanks to everybody. Numbers popping through the roof, never be seen before numbers here for us here on Books and Looks. Really happy the way things are going on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Keep listening, folks, because I'm coming back every week, okay? So anyway, this is brought to you, as always, by the good folks at Podcast Studio X. So get that little thing in there. If you want a good podcast, go to Podcast Studio X. Hey, listen, this book with Scott Lord is really fascinating. Scott's an interesting guy. He's going to talk to us a little bit about his career because he is a practicing attorney. There are a lot of lawyers who write books. Accountants don't do that. Economists don't do that. But lawyers seem to like to write books. But that's not what's fascinating about Scott. He's going to tell us about his second career, which is a librettist. That's right, a librettist. Oh, my word, we're getting into opera, folks. So Scott's going to talk all about that. He's going to be telling us how this story, Come November, was inspired by his mother and a trip she took back in 1947 to the UN. You see, this is a dual timeline story that Scott has here because it begins in 2003 and then swings back to 1947. It's about, I think there's a little bit of healing with the 2000 timeline, okay, of the family, but there's also going back to 47 when we're there for the creation of the State of Israel. Now, this is extremely relevant nowadays because we all know what's happened a few weeks ago, and this goes down to the vote in the United Nations about the creation of Israel. Scott has used archival noting and newspapers and links and very good, very, very good research on this, plus his mother. Now, his mother wasn't there, he's explaining, for that vote, but was there for all the lead up to that vote. This is about two journalists who meet in 1947. One's in high school, one just got back from World War II. And he's very young too, just 20 or 21 years old. And their relationship during that time in 47, and then what's happening in 2003. Now this, it's historical. It's a historical fiction. It's a thriller because we have all sorts of people trying to delay the vote, sabotage the vote, you name it. You're on your edge of the seat. You're going to learn facts you didn't know about. For instance, lake success. I never heard of lake success. He's going to tell us what lake success is. It's wonderful. This is a really, really good book from all things. We're also going to talk about the Spoleto Festival in Italy. Every summer they have the Spoleto Festival, and the 2003 timeline has us getting to that festival with the operas and everything else. So this is a really well put together book and one I think you're going to really enjoy. So without any further ado, let's go right into my interview with Scott Lord. Scott, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you so much, Blaine. Thanks for having me on.
It's good to have another fellow attorney on.
I don't hear that often, so it's nice. I appreciate your saying that.
It's amazing how many attorneys are now writing books, and I don't know if that means we're tired of practicing law or just we have better things to talk about than the law. I'm not sure, but tell us a little bit about yourself, Scott. Where are you from? Where'd you go to college? Did you take any writing courses or anything like that?
Sure. Well, I was born in Chicago back in the 50s and moved to LA with my family when I was about 8 years old. Went to UC Santa Cruz, so I'm a proud banana slug for college, and then Santa Clara University School of Law in up near San Jose. I practiced in San Jose for maybe 10 years and then moved back home to LA, and here I've been ever since.
Did you take any creative writing courses or any writing courses at all during your time in college?
I did. I took one in my freshman year. I always sort of thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but I always did have a dream that one day I'd write a book. So I took creative writing in college. And then as I moved on in practice, I started taking some courses, extension courses from UCLA.
Hmm.
which I found really, really helpful.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. That's great. And again, I am amazed at how many of you writers have taken these extension courses. I've never looked into one of those, but right now I'm too busy reading just to write. But I should look into some of them sometime.
Right. Well, it was a pleasant surprise to me because the teachers were mostly practicing writers themselves.
Oh,
So
okay.
they had a wealth of practical experience to
Yeah.
help us with.
Oh.
And then, there's sort of a nice thing about having a weekly course where you're expected to produce something because
Hmm.
it puts a little onus on you to come up with, 5,000, maybe 10,000 words a week, which
Wow.
is very helpful.
Yeah. Wow, that's really something. Well, now, in addition to being an attorney, and we know you just came from court. Yeah, friends, he was in court this morning, and
I did.
they told the judge, I got to go. I got an interview for Books and Looks. So the judge let him go. But you also have another fascinating profession. You are a librettist. Now,
Yes.
some might not know what that is, Scott. Could you tell everybody what is a librettist?
Yeah, well, a librettist, the word is similar to libretto, which is the words that go with an opera, usually the classic opera type. So a librettist is the individual who writes what we might call the lyrics for the songs for an opera. I'm a lifelong opera fan. I'm half Italian on my mom's side and sort of grew up with it in the house. And then as I got into adulthood, I have an older brother who's a composer. And one day he said, we should write an opera. Sort of took off from there.
Get out of here. Now, that's fascinating. That's absolutely I didn't know you had a brother who was a composer. I can see
Yeah.
why he would want his brother to help him. Now, here's the thing. Do you write the story before he writes the music, or does he write the music and then you write the story to fit the music? How does that go?
That's a great question. He came up, the first one we wrote together, he came up with the topic, and we had a friend who was a screenwriter. I live in Los Angeles, so screenwriters are fairly plentiful on the ground, but really helped us and said, let's sit down and do the structure. So we came up with a complete outline, and then I decided a particular scene I was going to write, and I gave it a try, and then my brother, David, wrote some music for it, and usually we have the words before the music. He might have some ideas or thoughts, but he likes to use the words as a roadmap for his composition.
I see. Now, these are performed professionally, I'm assuming?
We have had a couple performances. We just finished the first one, probably, I think it was around 2018, and we were going to have it produced. And then, of course, the pandemic hit.
Right.
So we were able to do some public performances of it, but a lot of the opera houses, along with a lot of other things, were closed. So we're working on getting it back up on its feet and going, and hopefully we'll get it produced next year.
Wow. Well, that's great. I can't wait to hear about it. I want to have a link so I can listen to it or somehow. I want to, because that's wonderful. You wonder, is opera dying?
That's an interesting question. Classic opera, it's harder and harder to get people to come out for. But interestingly, new opera, some of which is, sort of different than the old classics, some that incorporate electronics,
Yes.
Younger people will come out for. So I think opera companies are trying to find a mix of old and new and get people to come out for live music.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. Great. All right. Well, then you always wanted to become a writer. You thought you might become a writer.
Yeah.
What was your first book, and when did you start that? And when was your first book?
I started writing a book probably 25 years ago when I was still heavily practicing. And I would come home late in the evening, I'm a trial lawyer, and I'd sit down and make myself write 5 pages. And I just was never quite able to finish it. But then I started working a little less in maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I wrote a book about a practicing lawyer who gets into all sorts of trouble with his criminal clients. And it's sort of a legal thriller. It's called The Logic Bomb. Came out about 7 years ago. And sold a few copies to people I didn't know, which was really nice. And but it was a lot of fun to write.
Good. All right. So then you start this new book. And what was the inspiration behind your current book, which is called Come November?
2 things. One thing I wanted to explore was the history that I discovered from a trip my mother had taken back in 1947 when she was a senior in high school. to visit the new United Nations. And she happened to be there during the time that the debates occurred regarding the partition of Palestine and the creation of Israel. Mm-hmm. So I always thought that that would be an interesting story. At the same time, I had started a book about an older woman, a woman in her early 70s, who is trying to decide whether to reunite with an old flame from her youth. And at some point, the idea struck me to combine them and sort of tell the tale both from a more current time, the early 2000s, and back in 1947.
Right. Wow. Well, it's done very well. I can tell you that much. Very well written, and good stuff. Now, did your mother ever talk to you about her experiences back then in 1947?
Yes, it was something she was understandably proud of. She, along with about 80 other student editors of their school papers from Chicago, were selected by the Chicago Sun, which eventually became the Chicago Sun-Times, to go on this trip. And they went to New York and visited the United Nations. So it was a major event in her life. It became one of those stories that as kids, you start rolling your eyes a little bit like, oh, now we're going to hear the story about the trip to New York again. But yeah, she absolutely discussed it and talked about it.
Now, you found, or you have, a box of her old memorabilia and clippings and things like that. Had you seen that before, or did you just stumble upon that now?
I had seen it when I was younger, and then my mom passed away about 30 years ago. And somehow one of my brothers, I have 4 brothers, one of them ended up with that. And at some point, and I think it was probably around when I was starting to write the book, one of my brothers said, "Oh, I still have that scrapbook." And I thought, oh my gosh, you got to bring it over. So I still have it, and it's got pictures from the paper. It's got Chicago Sun articles about the trip. Plus, she put in a lot of little memorabilia, like the tickets to the United Nations, the menu from the train they were on, things like that are just fascinating.
That's great. That's a great experience that your mom had. Wow. Now, did she ever go into journalism at all?
Yes, she graduated when she was, I guess, 17 or 18 and got hired by a local paper in Chicago. And within 2 years, by the time she was 20, she was the editor-in-chief. I mean, it was a small paper. It wasn't the Chicago Tribune. And so she worked at that for several years. But as tended to happen in the 50s, she got married and started having my brothers and myself and went on to some other types of work.
Did she ever encourage you to become a journalist?
Not so much a journalist, but she loved the fact that I wrote. She was, I have to say, she was my biggest fan.
Good.
She was one of those parents who, as a kid, you'd write something or do something artistic. And whether it was good or not, Blaine, she would say, "Oh, that is just wonderful." And she'd always find something nice to pick out and compliment me on. So, yeah, she was a terrific supporter of that.
That's great. That's great. Now, you have... And before we get into the book, you have this dual timeline of basically current day and then 1947. Now, when you sit down to write that, Scott, did you write all the current things at one time, then all the 1947 things at another time, and then blend it? Or did you write chapter by chapter by chapter?
More the latter. I actually wrote it more or less in the order it is in now in the published book. I had an outline. I'm sort of a medium between people who just sit down and start writing and people who outline every single page. Mm-hmm. And I had sort of a rough outline. And as I've done with other books I've written, I had the ending before I really got started because I always like to know what's going to happen at the end. So
Okay. Well, that's great.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. That's great. Be able to go back and forth. And like you said, when you're talking about 60 years, different times, basically, in these people's lives, that's a long time to go back and forth and remember everything. So that's wonderful. You could do it like that. Good for you.
There's sort of a fun to being able to do that because obviously as the author, we're sort of omniscient. And so I can have things set up in 1947 that will come to fruition, 60 years later in 2003.
But one of the things that hooked me on your book, Scott, was the opening chapters, which took place, which I thought was a very good opening nowadays, okay? And basically you gave every main character almost a chapter, and you were able to explain what was going on in their lives a little bit. Was that what you always had wanted to do instead of moshing it all into one or two big chapters?
Yes is the short answer. There's different theories, and writers are different, and different writing teachers will give you different views. I find as a reader, I like to write something that I think I would like to read. And one of the things I like in a book is that they sort of clearly identify the characters that you're going to be involved in through the course of the novel. I think it helps maintain reader interest, because if hopefully they like your characters, then they care about them and they want to read on. So yeah, very quickly I decided I would open it in that fashion.
Well, as I said, it was a great way for me to get introduced to the characters, because so many times, Scott, you're reading a book and the first 30 pages, you're still sort of floundering. Who's who, where's what, and who's related to whom. And
yes.
This one, friends, when you read this book, you're going to really appreciate the work that he put into this, because it's well done, well thought out, and you know exactly who is who and the characters, and just superb stuff there, Scott.
Oh,
superb.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. I remember as a younger reader, when the time came to read the Russian novels, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, they were great books, of course, but I literally had to sit down and make an outline of who was who and what they did and how they were related to other people. And I didn't want readers to have to do that.
Yeah. No, and I get intimidated when I get a book like War and Peace and it opens up with a listing of all the characters, and it's 4 pages long, and that's too much. Can't do that.
Yes.
No, I'm not going to refer back. I got to figure it out. So, too much.
Yes.
Anyway, let's talk a little bit now let's get into this book. Now, you got 2 main characters, Jean Cooper and John McGrath. Tell us a little bit about them, and then the plot of the book.
Sure. Jean, when we meet her, is in her early 70s, recently widowed. She teaches English, online courses in English, and it's set in the year 2003. And she's originally born in Chicago. She has an adult son who's married, though he's estranged from his wife, and she has 1 granddaughter. John McGrath, is a journalist. He was also from Chicago. His father was a police officer who was killed in the line of duty. John was in World War II. He was young, but as you might know, a lot of guys enlisted when they were 16 or 17. He fought in Europe. And then when he came back, got a job with the Chicago Sun. And then later on, his ambition was to be an international journalist, a foreign correspondent, so to speak. And that's when we find him in 2003. He's in his middle 70s and living in Italy, with the dream of creating a sort of a bed and breakfast or an inn that will help support him in his older years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, these 2 have a bit of a backstory, because they met back in 1947, and then again later in the 70s, I think it was, in Los Angeles. How did they get together there?
Well, Jean, and again, similar to what happened to my mother, she was on this trip to go to the United Nations. John was assigned by the Chicago Sun to be the reporter who reported on the trip. And so they met in the course of the trip, actually on the initial train ride to New York. And there was an instant attraction. And as the days progressed, they went out, enjoyed each other's company, and then thought they were going to have, this would be their great love affair. For reasons that are explained in the book, it didn't quite work out that way. Mm-hmm. By chance, they met each other again when they were in their 40s. Didn't work out then either. But in the 2003 portion of the book, John's, as I say, living in Italy, and writes Jean sort of out of the blue, sends her an email and says, "Hey, come to Italy, and maybe we'll write a book about our time in New York."
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good thing to do. Got them back together. We got everything. We saw there was a relationship, and both times the relationship crumbled. Now, do you think it was one person's fault or the other? I know I have a point of view on that, but I don't know what your point of view is when you wrote it. Was it one person or the other, or both?
I tend to think it was mostly John's fault. He's career oriented. He had a great ambition to be a top journalist and to be, as I say, an international journalist. And when the time came to make a choice, back in 1947, he opted to live in New York and then eventually go overseas rather than trying to make his life something in a way that he would be able to stay with Jean. So I think it was his decision to put career over love, so to speak, that happened then. Later on, when they tried it again in their 40s, there were other issues. He had another ongoing relationship that wasn't working out. And I think that was a large part of the reason that it didn't work out then.
I see. Okay. See, now I took it the other way. I thought Jean was expecting more because she was just a high school senior, and expecting him to bend to her. And I think he had told her that he wanted to be an international reporter and looking for something more than what he was doing at Chicago. And, it could be read either way, but it just didn't work. That's the whole trouble.
Well, that's interesting, Blaine. I never quite thought of it that way, but in a way that's true. She, didn't want to bend her life either. So I can't argue with you there.
And it didn't help that while he was seeing her in those few days in New York, he also met another lady who captivated him also. So that's very, very interesting stuff. Well, that's great. Now this wasn't autobiographical, was it? Your mom and dad, was it?
No, not at all.
Okay.
My dad was far more prosaic. They did meet. They actually went to high school, the same high school, but 4 years apart. So they didn't meet until after my dad had graduated.
Okay. I didn't know how much that was any part of the backstory there.
Boy, that would be something. I would have made that a memoir, I think.
Now, this book, which deals with the creation of Israel, and of course, friends, as we're recording this, you have seen what's been going on the last week, 10 days. I don't know. I don't read the news too much, but it's back in the news again. Israel, Gaza, Palestinian. Well, we're going back to the creation in 1947. Scott takes us back there. But there are a lot of people and places, Scott, who people aren't familiar with, including me. What and where is Lake Success? I had no idea where that was.
Well, that's a great question. It's interesting you asked that because my working title for the book was Lake Success. I sort of liked the image that created. But as we were getting closer to publication and the publisher was doing what they do, which is try to figure out what will help sell the book, they said, a lot of people can't tell from that title what the book's about. So to answer your question, Lake Success is a kind of a tiny village in Long Island. And for a number of reasons, which would take some time to go into, the first offices of the United Nations were in a building in Lake Success. So a lot of diplomats, a lot of United States personnel were in Lake Success when the UN was in session.
I see. So it's not that big building that we all now recognize as the UN headquarters. That wasn't around at that time.
Yeah, that was built in the early 50s.
Okay. So now we're in Lake Success, which is an interesting the name for where the UN's located at.
That's what I thought. There was a little irony there. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Now, at that time, there was, and again, a lot of people don't realize this, the very first Secretary General was a guy named Turgeva Lee.
They usually pronounce it Trygve. I don't know if that's correct or not. It's Norwegian. Trygve Lie was from Norway.
Okay, so he's the first Secretary General, I guess. He's from Norway.
Yes.
Yeah, no one paints too good a picture of him, do they?
It's interesting because I think, and I read a biography of him as part of my research for the book. I think he was a fascinating guy and like a lot of those early UN diplomats was really believed in the institution and wanted it to succeed. But he was a compromise candidate. The U.S. wanted one guy, the Soviets wanted someone else, and somehow they were able to agree on Mr. Lai. I think the reason the novel paints a bit of a negative picture of him is because a number of the players involved in the 1947 vote on partition felt he should have been more on their side. And so you had a situation where the Arab contingent thought that he was biased in favor of Israel. And the Israeli, or Zionists as they called him at the time, thought that he was biased in favor of the Arabs, which to me meant he was probably doing his job. But he did come in for some criticism.
Yeah. Wow. Who doesn't in that position? I mean, everybody gets in that. See, the first one I remember was Dag Hammarskjöld. That's the first Secretary General I remembered.
Same. I think you and I are more or less the same vintage. Yeah, I remember Mr. Hammarskjöld.
So when you gave that name, however you pronounce it, the Norwegian gentleman,
yes,
I had no idea if that was a real character or not, but he certainly was real. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I tried to keep the history part. I tried to include as many actual historical figures as I could, just, for verisimilitude, but also I think it makes it more interesting. I know as a reader, and I've always been a fan of historical fiction, I like to learn, and it's kind of fun.
Well, now, were there other historical figures that you used in the book?
Yeah, sure. I most prominently was Moshe Sheret. His original name was Shurtak, but like a lot of Israelis, after the State of Israel was created, he wanted to adopt a name that was a little more significant. But anyway, Mr. Sheret was the first foreign secretary of Israel and the second prime minister. He was one of the prime movers behind the Zionist movement to establish Israel. So I did a lot of research on him, and I also had the great pleasure of finding out that his daughter was still alive, although in the early 90s.
Whoa. And
she was kind enough to read the chapters relating to her father and give me comments and suggestions about how to portray him more accurately, which was I really treasured. The Syrian ambassadors, other members of the United Nations, the United States contingent, almost all those historical figures that are depicted in the book are actual people. And where I have them saying things, where there's dialogue or something of that nature, I tried to get it from original sources, either newspapers or their own writings.
Oh, I see. Okay. Now, and wasn't Abba Eban in there also at some point? Wasn't?
Yeah, he was, in my view, just a towering figure. Yes, he was the representative of the soon-to-be Israelis to the United Nations. Just a brilliant man. I read both his autobiography as well as biographies. He was a big figure there too.
Okay. Well, now, it's a lot of us don't know that history and the history of the creation and everything else that goes on. But you also bring up some things that there may be assassins in there. There may be, people trying to kill diplomats, warn diplomats. Tell us a little bit about that. And was that from historical perspective, or is that just the creation that you did?
Almost all of it was based on fairly solid historical record. There was a tremendous amount of violence, really starting in the early 1900s, certainly in the 1920s, in Palestine. There was, as more and more Jewish settlers moved to the area, there was greater and greater conflicts. And in fact, there was a great violent uprising of Arab peoples. I don't know if they were exclusively Palestinian in the mid-30s. And then there was this character I depict in the novel he was called the Mufti of Jerusalem. He was a man who actually fought against the Allies during World War II, cooperated with Hitler, and was one of the most zealous foes of the creation of Israel. And certainly there were many killings, most of them in the Middle East area. But on the months leading up to the vote, there was an assassination of a British official in London that was later related to the vote. There was bombing at an embassy in Rome. So it wasn't too far-fetched for me to think, especially given the public statements of someone like the Mufti of Jerusalem, that they would have tried assassination as a way to try to stop the vote, which was their main goal.
And you do this and portray this beautifully with this becomes almost in effect a thriller, and that what's going on. You never know what's going to happen because they're getting ready to have a vote. And the next thing we know, all these diplomats, as they say, get out of Dodge. What was that historically correct? Did they leave?
It is. The reason I gave, that is that they were afraid of being killed or assassinated, was something that I created. But it was what we lawyers would call a reasonable assumption based on the evidence. This major vote, probably the biggest vote in the young UN's life, was about to take place. And suddenly, the Wednesday before the Friday that the vote was to take place, 100 of the UN diplomats got on the Queen Mary and sailed for London. And there's some great pictures from the New York Times of the diplomats leaving. And there was some reasons given. Oh, there was another conference they had to attend. But it certainly seemed odd. And I thought it wasn't unreasonable to suppose that there may have been some connection with the fear of violence.
Wow. Now, have there been other books about this, Scott? I know we hadn't spoken about this before, but did you take this from other novels or histories? 'Cause I don't remember any of this, reading any of this.
I have not found one. And believe me, before I went to the trouble of preparing the novel, I wanted to see if I was the first one to track this path or not. And the short answer is no. I haven't found any other novel that depicts this scene, this period of time, the vote in the UN. There's obviously a number of historical sources, but nothing that's treated it in fiction.
Wow, that's very, very well done, and then that's the hallmark of quality historical fiction, not just what the fiction is, but the history behind it and the use of that history. And this is, again, I can't say enough. This is a wonderful job that Scott did in this book, and you top notch, Scott.
You're
really.
so kind.
Well, yeah. I think I communicated with you after the first or second chapter that I read. You had hooked me early on, so
you did. It was very nice to hear.
Yeah. Now we come back to the more current times, and we got Jean. Now her son. I think it's another thing. We got lots of people here, lots of things, dynamics going on. He's got problems too, and that's a big part of this book. Tell us a little bit about Jean's son.
Jean's son, Michael, is at the time of the modern part of the book, the 2003 timeline, is about 40 years old. He's a real estate developer. He's married to a woman by the name of Carrie, who's an opera singer. And we talked a little bit about opera. And their marriage is a little bit troubled. And Carrie, and in a way, this echoes John's decisions to put career over family, decides she's going to move to New York without him to pursue her opera career. At the same time, Michael is having great financial difficulties. His investments are going south. He's in a lot of trouble. And as the book depicts in the early chapters, he thinks his only way out is to ask his mother to give him money. She's not super rich, but she's well off and could probably afford to help him.
And there's a large insurance payment that may be coming, which could have helped him.
Right. Her husband, she's a widow, her husband who passed away from illness, did have $1 million insurance policy that was about to come through. And so, of course, Michael, as many children might think, well, gosh, mom's got plenty of money. Maybe she'll help me out of this jam.
And very well and accurately portrayed the reluctance of the insurance company to pay you.
That's something as a lawyer I have a lot of experience with.
Oh, I'll tell you. They love to take your premium, don't they? Oh, my. But anyway, they end up, and this is great, because now, folks, we shift again. Now we shift over to Italy. We're in Umbria. Oh, I love Umbria. One of my favorite places. Being Italian, I do love that central part from Tuscany to Umbria. Then my relatives are from Le Marche. And tell us a little bit about why were they going to Umbria?
Well, the main reason they were going to Umbria is I spent a wonderful time there, and I was maybe 20 years ago, in a town called Todi, which is depicted in the book. So I'm being a little facetious. But yeah, John, as I said, is in his early 70s. And so he's found this farmhouse near Todi, which he's trying to renovate and turn into an inn or B&B. But by coincidence, Jean's daughter-in-law, Carrie, who's the opera singer, has been invited to participate in the production in Spoleto, which is in Umbria as well. Spoleto has an annual summer music festival called the Festival of Two Worlds, and it's mostly classical music, frequently opera. So John's there, he's invited Jean there, and then finds out that her daughter-in-law is also going there. So it becomes a place where they all sort of meet and interact. Right.
And then, of course, we have the daughter there, the the daughter, that's Jean's granddaughter, she's caught in the middle of this whole thing, and she had to go to New York with her mother, and now she's being, in her opinion, dragged over to Italy.
Yes.
She's an interesting character. I like her.
Yeah. Alice is at about 60 to 2003, the 2003 timeline. And I have a number of children, two of whom are girls, who I helped raise. And so it was a pleasure to me to be able to use some of the knowledge, the hard-won knowledge I'd gained as a parent of what teenage girls can be like. Yeah, she is at odds with her father. She's got difficulties with her mother. But the one person she knows she loves and trusts is her grandmother, Jean.
Right.
And so this, having her there is a way to sort of depict both the troubled family life that she has, but also show the effect that a grandchild and a grandparent can have on each other.
Well, now we go swing back. And again, folks, we go swing back and forth very seamlessly. Now we're swinging back to the 40s again. And one of the things I didn't ask you, I should have done it earlier, is why was France so important to this vote?
There was a couple of reasons why. There was a thought that France would be able to swing the vote, partly because France was, of course, one of the old colonial powers. And a number of its colonies were in Muslim areas, both in North Africa as well as the Middle East. In fact, France had just, by the mid-40s, had just gotten out of Syria, which they had dominated and controlled for many years. And so there was a thought that France would be able to, would be going with its former colonies and voting with them. And this was a vote that was pretty close, so every vote counted. The one other reason, as those who are of a historical mind might remember, there's a bit of a history of anti-Semitism in France. You go back to the Dreyfus case and those sorts of things. Yeah. So there was a real fear on behalf of supporters of Israel that France would sort of revert to its anti-Semitic ways and sort of lead a lot of other people to vote against the creation of Israel.
I see. Okay, so that's in there also. Very good. Yeah, that's, and what happens back in 1947 is the creation of Israel, the partition that occurred over there. A lot of things were being partitioned. We had India and Pakistan back then. We've got now.
But the same year.
Yeah, same year. Yeah. And what always, this is a little beyond probably the scope of your book, Scott, but what always amazed me was that when you have a war and you have vanquished somebody, you to the winners goes the spoils. But here, the Arabs and the Muslims were our allies, and we decided to take land from them. I never heard of that before. Had you?
Not in the way that it happened here.
Right.
I'm far from qualified to discourse on the history of the region, but I did do, my research and, of course, try to keep up with things.
Right.
There are so many different issues. Oil, of course, even back then was a big issue.
Yes.
And of course, at that time, the U.S. had oil, certain areas of Europe and the Soviet Union did. But most of the known oil reserves at the time were under the control of the Arabs. And that was a big factor in the U.S. consideration. It's a big factor in Britain's considerations.
Yeah.
So while at the same time they wanted to help Jews create Israel, and of course there was a great impetus because of the Holocaust.
Right.
They were reluctant to do something that would totally alienate the Arab world.
Mm-hmm. It put everybody in a very, very difficult position. Yes. And as we've seen, there have been numerous wars, there have been numerous incursions. We've now got the most recent thing that's going on that I can't figure out exactly how and why and everything else, and it's too much for me. But it's splitting apart not just the Middle East. It splits apart the whole world and our country. It's a fascinating, disturbing topic.
Well, it really is, and one of my earlier memories as a young teenager was the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, the Six-Day War, which was the first time that I really realized that there were people that still hated the Jews so much that they wanted to, as they would say at that time, drive them into the sea.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there was the 1973 war, which, was threatened to go nuclear because the Soviets were on one side supporting the Arabs. The U.S. was on the other side supporting Israel. It was amazing. It didn't get worse. So,
I know.
yeah, it's been a tangle for a long time. And of course, one of the things I did in researching it is I wanted to try to get all sides. So I certainly read sources from the Arab and Palestinian side. And I must tell you, there's a very different view of what went on, which I tried to some extent to present in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you do. It's interesting. Even within the Arabs, the nations themselves, and some of the diplomats one way, some are a different way. The assassins, he tied in with somebody else, I think. Right. And so like I said, it's a thriller, and you never know what's going to happen and how it's going to end up. Well, we know how it ends up in the sense of that Israel is created, but I mean, you don't know how all these parts are going to go together. And it was just truly a wonderful job. Now it's
oh, thanks so much.
Well, now by the end of the book, yes, folks, there is an ending. It's not as epic as 1,000 pages, okay? No. But there's so much to talk about. But by the end of the book, we come back to the modern times, and I see this as a time of healing. Almost all the relationships get healed, don't they?
Yeah.
The Jean with John or Jack, as he's known, her son, the daughter-in-law, the daughters, the granddaughters, much calmer, everything else. There's a lot more healing that goes on in this book. I was impressed with that. Did you expect that? Was that what you were looking for?
Well, one of the things I like to do when I write a novel is create an arc for each of the characters. And as you pointed out when we first got started, I sort of present the characters in the beginning, giving each of the main ones a chapter. Mm-hmm. And I think what's interesting to me as a reader, and hopefully to other readers, is to see them grow, to go through emotional difficulties, to see them confront their problems and try to find some resolution. Of course, the problem in any book that, in a sense, is a romance, even though we're dealing with people in their 70s, is part of what you do as an author or writer of a screenplay is create obstacles.
Right.
So at some point, you have to decide, are they going to overcome those obstacles, or is the reader going to be left with a romance that didn't quite make it?
Right. Well, one of the obstacles that John had to overcome was the fact that they wanted him to write this book about what really happened back in 1947, which was buried.
Right.
But the hook was they wanted Jean for it to be her story. That's interesting.
Right. The publisher, and as depicted in the book, the publisher told John, or Jack, as he's called in his later years, gee, I'd love to have a memoir about that whole assassination thing. And then John or Jack told him about the involvement of Jean when she was, a young high school student. Mm-hmm. And I think the motivation, and certainly from my research and just general knowledge of books and reading and the industry, is that by sort of a very large margin, more women buy books than men. Mm-hmm. And this, I think it's especially true in fiction, but it's sort of generally true too. And I think the publisher's argument, at least as I depict it in the book, is that, yeah, it's great having you, Mr. International Correspondent, but what we think will interest people is Jean's story, how she saw it as a 17-year-old girl, witnessing these events, going through this horrific potential assassination. And they just seem to think that would make it more interesting to the potential readers.
Well, and the fact is that while there, she's writing his stories to send back to Chicago.
Yes.
And she's taking notes about everything that's going on. It's really very well done how she got involved with this.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting because part of the scrapbook from my mom was the articles from the Chicago Sun that were written about the trip. And so, yeah, I had the idea that, they're not, journalism of the highest order. It's reporting on a bunch of students going around New York. And so I thought, well, certainly she could have written these articles herself rather than the Chicago Sun reporter.
No, it's like I said, it's very good, very interesting. And we're not even going to get to the fact that the mafia somehow gets involved in this also. A little bit.
Well, he's in Italy. I'm half Italian. You're Italian. And,
yeah.
And that's a reality. I'll never forget my grandfather, who was a banker in Chicago back in the 20s and 30s. After The Godfather, the movie came out, or the book, I remember asking him, Grandpa, did you know people in the mafia? And he gave me the most serious look I'd ever seen him give, looked at me and said, yes. And that was all he ever said.
That's all they say.
Talked about it.
Oh, boy. Well, that's another part of this whole book. It all comes together. Hey, this character, John McGrath, before we leave this, is he based on any journalist in particular?
No, his physical look is based on a friend of mine named John. Okay. But in terms of his character and the things he did and the things he went through in life, no, I didn't have a source or basis. Obviously, I did my research in terms of journalism and the various journalists of the time and read a lot of the journalism of the time.
I see.
But not in terms of his character or his various traits.
Okay, good. Now, what's next? What's coming up next for Scott Lord? Do we have another novel in you, Scott?
Yes, it's the short answer. I'm working on two. I have a novel that I'm writing about, which people would call a coming-of-age novel, early 70s, which would be based somewhat on my life growing up in the San Fernando Valley. And then I'm working on a sequel to this book, which will involve John rather than Jean, but that will take place in 1956. Around the time of the Suez Canal crisis.
Oh, my. That'll be fantastic, yeah.
And I've started the research, and I've written the first few chapters, and then I'm at the point now where I've got to sit down and really do my outline. So I'm hopeful I'll have both of those finished in the next 6 to 12 months.
Wow. That won't... It's not going to be like, come December, come January.
No, I haven't thought of a title yet. And after thinking of this one as Lake Success for years, I'm not sure I want to get attached to a new title. So.
Well, I'll tell you, that's wonderful. And you're still doing your libretto work and helping out your brother, and that's really wonderful. Well, anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you, Scott. I really appreciate you taking your time today and from your law practice and the courts and everything else to spend a few minutes with us here on Books and Looks.
Well, Blaine, I really appreciate your having me. It's been a pleasure answering your questions as best I could.
You've done a fine job. Friends, we're going to be right back in a moment. Well, again, thank you, Scott. Really, really enjoyable interview. And folks, a great book that's out now. Again, Come November by Scott Lord. I think you're going to really enjoy this book. He's a really interesting guy. And boy, I enjoyed having him on here. Hey, what's going on that I'm looking at? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm looking at long-range weather forecasts. Are you? I'll tell you why. In the past week or so, I have been bombarded by news stories from the NOAA, National Oceanographic, who knows what AA stands for. But it's a federal government thing, and they put out the forecasts and track hurricanes and everything else. They're giving us their long-term winter forecast. And as everybody's sitting there and looking at it, as one person said most appropriately, with El Nino now factoring in, it could be wetter than normal, drier than normal, or maybe just the same. Folks, that's one hell of a help to you and me, isn't it? A little more, a little less, maybe the same. Who knows? I don't know, because I went back to look at past long-range forecasts by NOAA, and they're wrong more than they're right. I mean, they didn't really call this summer's heat wave. Not really. Didn't really hit it out of the park on that one. So here they are. The fall, they're saying one thing. In fact, they're calling it to be warmer than normal down here where I'm at in South Carolina. All I can tell you is tomorrow night it's going to be 33 degrees. The next night, 29. 20. That's warmer? No, not really, folks. That's colder. So I don't know where they get their information from. El Nino and La Nina and things are getting screwed up because of all this. I don't know. But do you pay much attention to it? Nah. You know what? 3 months at a time is too large of a segment. If you want to pay attention to anything, pay attention to, yes, the woolly caterpillar. That's right. The woolly caterpillar has been predicting the weather for a long, long time. Yes, and according to, we all know the legend of the groundhog. Well, the woolly caterpillar has the same thing, and apparently, according to the woolly caterpillar, the longer than the black bands, the longer the woolly caterpillar's black bands means it'll be colder and snowier and more severe in the winter. So I want you to go out and look for your woolly caterpillars if you have any in your area, because they're going to probably be a better inclination as to what's going on for the winter than these long-term forecasts, which hedge their bets more than anything else. I guess that's what bothers me. If you're going to put out a long-term forecast, stay behind it. Stick behind it. Don't start hemming and hawing. Well, maybe more, but it could be less. And there's even a possibility to be just like before. Okay, that does nobody any good. But anyway, that's what I've been looking at, and I don't think I'm going to be looking at that anymore. I'm just going to be searching for the woolly caterpillar. So anyway, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.